Good morning. I'm hoping this is going to be a good take because this is take 4 of my video for you this morning. For those of you looking at me a little strangely, some of you may be thinking, who is this woman? We haven't seen her in a long time. Or maybe some of you are new to our videos and to our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And so I just want to remind everybody of who I am. My name is Mary Kendall. I am the pastor of Living Faith Church here in West Seneca, New York. We have been studying the God-given appetites that we have all received, and we've been looking at how to feed those appetites in healthy and unhealthy ways. We're trying to stay away from the unhealthy ways and to lean into the healthy ways. So as I begin our discussion this week, let me give to you a quote from a very wise man who lived many, many years ago. He said this: "All people spend their lives scratching for food, but they never seem to have enough." And actually, the speaker of that statement was more than just a wise man. He was actually the wisest man who has ever lived on the face of the earth, and his name is Solomon. Solomon is the author of 3 of the books that we find in the Old Testament. He authored Proverbs. And Proverbs is where we see the wisdom of Solomon. There's also a book that he wrote called the Song of Solomon, and sometimes different Bibles will title that book as the Song of Songs. But it's in that book where we actually see the love of God that people can experience when they live life for God and with God. And then the third book that is authored by Solomon is called the Book of Ecclesiastes. And in this book, Solomon gives us his autobiography for the years that he lived foolishly, trying to live life away from God. So he gives us a very transparent look at what he was trying to do and what he observed other people doing. And it was during that time that Solomon penned the quote I opened today with. It comes out of chapter 6, verse 7. And that's when he looked and he observed people that were living their lives scratching for food, but never seeming to have enough of it. And I think people today are still trying to do many things without God. I think we're still trying to scratch out an existence, but many of us are trying to do it without God. And sadly, many of the people that are trying to live life without God don't even realize that that's what they're doing. And we call these people Christian atheists. Now that's a weird term, isn't it? How can you be a Christian and an atheist at the same time? Well, let me explain. Christian atheists believe in God, but they live life as though he does not exist. In other words, they want enough of Jesus to be saved from an eternity separated from God. They want enough of Jesus so that they get their ticket to heaven rather than hell. But they don't want so much of Jesus that he's going to have any expectation that they change anything about their lives. So they want to live life the way they want to live it, even if that opposes the ways of God. But they still want to get to heaven. That's a Christian atheist. Now, why would I bring this up when we're in the middle of a study on the appetites that God has given to each of us? Well, I bring it up for this reason. I'm hoping that as we're walking through a look at these God-given appetites, that we're not just taking this in as information. I hope that we're being transformed because of it, because that's the intention of Bible study. Not that we get head knowledge only, but Bible study is supposed to transform us, not just inform us. So anytime that we look at a series or a discussion in the Bible, we're supposed to be looking at our own lives and saying, okay, what adjustments do I need to get in line with the Word of God? So I hope that's what's happening in this series, that as we look at these appetites and I expose ways that are healthy and unhealthy to feed them, I hope that we're taking note of adjustments that we need to make in our own lives so that we're being sure that we're feeding these appetites in healthy ways. One other thing that we can do with these appetites is to completely starve them. And that's not a good thing either, because God has given us these appetites to be fed. He wants us to feed them in healthy ways so that we can live a very balanced life and live it to the full. So far, we've looked at 4 appetites. When we started out during the week of April 19th, we looked at the appetite that we have for fellowship with God. And then during the week of April 26th, we began to look at the appetite we have for pleasure. And then during the week of May 3rd, we looked at our appetite for sex. And last week, we looked at the appetite we have for companionship. And so today, we're turning our attention to the most obvious of all of our appetites for food. There was a man who entered a restaurant many years ago. He was in a Florida hotel, and he went into the hotel's restaurant, and he took notice of a couple of people that were seated near him at nearby tables. This was before social distancing. But anyway, one of the men that came into the restaurant was John D. Rockefeller Sr., very wealthy man. And he noticed that Rockefeller's plate was sparsely covered with very healthy morsels of food. And also seated nearby was a waiter from that restaurant. He was on his dinner break, and he watched the man get his meal, and it was a nice, big, juicy steak with all the fixings, the potato and the vegetable and the bread and the butter and the dessert. He saw all of that go to that man. And here's John D. Rockefeller eating from a very sparsely populated plate of healthy food. And so the two extremes were not lost on this man. He noticed that the man who could easily afford the steak could not eat it because of his health. And he noticed that the man who could probably never afford a meal in that restaurant was able to eat the steak because of his job. And so here is what the observer walked away with. It is better to have a good appetite than to have a big bank account. It's in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 that God tells us what he designed for us to eat, and that is seed-bearing plants and all kinds of fruit trees. Then in chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, God told the man, look, you can eat from any tree in this garden except for one. That fruit from that one tree is forbidden to you. And so here we clearly see God telling the first man, here is a healthy way to feed your appetite for food. But that tree over there, that's forbidden. That's an unhealthy way to eat. But the man and the woman chose to eat from the one tree out of a beautiful garden filled with trees. That's the tree they went to and plucked the fruit off of that tree to eat in defiance of what God told them to do. And because of what they did, sin entered the world, and death became part of our human experience at that point. Now, I'm not suggesting that God wants everyone to be vegetarians today. But what I am trying to point out is that there was an original intention in paradise. He had, not just for food, but for our entire lives, how we were to live our lives. It was laid out in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. It was called paradise. You see, there was no death in the garden. Therefore, we were never intended to eat meat because we could not eat meat without death. But when the man and the woman decided to live life like they wanted to live it, sin entered the world. That's chapter 3 in Genesis. Chapter 1 and 2 describe paradise, and chapter 3 tell us what happened as a result of sin. And when sin entered into the world and death became part of the human experience, everything changed. This should cause us to sit up and take notice. We are no longer living in paradise. Instead, we're living in a world that is broken, and we live among sinful humanity. But are we really different from that first man and that first woman in the garden? Are we sitting up and taking notice of what happened as a result of their sin? Well, as it relates to food, you be the judge. Studies show that nearly 50% of American adults today are obese. Nearly 50% of adult Americans are obese. 40% of young Americans, those between 20 and 39 years of age, are obese. 40% of young adults. 45% of middle-aged adults, those between 40 and 59, are obese. And 43% of people, adults, living in America today that are 60 years of age and over, are obese. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that these numbers show we are not feeding our appetites for food in healthy ways. Not if we are a country that are filled with adults who are obese. Obesity causes all kinds of health conditions, and those health conditions lead to premature death for Americans, like heart disease, like stroke, like type 2 diabetes, and certain types of cancer. Now, when we allow our appetites for food to get out of control, we are threatening just about every other aspect of our lives. We have taught ourselves to eat in response to emotions we don't like. We have taught ourselves to use food as a pain reliever. We've even developed a term for this. It's called emotional eating. It's a term we use to describe what happens when we eat in response to stress or anxiety or depression or boredom or a host of other emotions, even good ones. In other words, we have taught ourselves to eat for reasons that have nothing to do with physical hunger. And haven't we even labeled some of our foods as comfort foods? We know them. My favorite, pizza and potato chips and cookies. What about macaroni and cheese or a big hearty plate filled with mashed potatoes? What about a bowl of ice cream? See, we have all kinds of personal preferences for these comfort foods, and studies show that certain foods actually do cause the brain to release chemicals that bring about feelings of pleasure. So if you eat in response to stress, you will feel better for a little while. But the cause of the stress doesn't go away because we eat something. So that feeling of stress is going to return. And stress is a funny thing. Stress doesn't like to return by himself or herself. Stress or any of these other emotions like depression or anxiety, they may come once by themselves, but they like to bring along some buddies on their return visits. And we call these buddies like guilt and shame. So when you maybe go to the freezer because you're feeling a sense of stress, and you take out that ice cream carton and you get a bowl and you get the scoop and you put some of the ice cream in a bowl and you go over to the recliner with a spoon and you eat that bowl of ice cream, you're responding to that feeling of stress. But see, when guilt and shame come into it, what happens eventually is that bowl of ice cream isn't going to suffice. Now we're just going to grab the carton of ice cream and a spoon and go to the recliner and have at it. And on and on and on that cycle will go. That's what happens. That's why Solomon made his observation in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 7. All people spend their lives scratching for food, but they never seem to have enough. Now, I think all of us are pretty learned on unhealthy ways to feed our appetites for food. So this week, we're going to focus in on healthy things we can do to learn to control our appetites and to feed them in healthy ways. Now, as I say every week, none of these suggestions that I'm giving to you are going to be earth-shattering. I'm not going to tell you anything tomorrow that you haven't heard 100 other times or more. But what I am going to tell us about effective ways to control and feed our appetites are proven ways. Ways that have been proven for us to effectively take control of our appetites and feed them in healthy ways. So I hope you'll come back tomorrow as I'm going to give us some of those healthy suggestions. And I hope, like I said earlier, that you're not just hearing these messages and racking it up as information, but I hope that you're using these studies to change the way you're living, because that is the intention of Bible study. Because if all you're doing is taking information, you may want to do a gut check and see, are you one of the Christian atheists? That you want to know enough about God, but you don't want God enough that you're going to have to change anything in your lives. I hope you're not. But I also hope that if you are, you're going to make those changes that are going to change your life so that you will no longer be living as a Christian atheist, but you'll be living as a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. And so I hope I'll be talking to you tomorrow.